Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Love Marriage.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
So, Whit, I was just reading the news like we do on this show, and I saw that Jay Leno, allegedly a comedian, has apologized for his history of making anti-Asian jokes. He said, and I'm quoting here, "I do not consider this particular case to be another example of cancel culture, but a legitimate wrong that was done on my part."
So I got to admit, I don't watch a lot of Jay Leno. I was more of a Letterman guy, but how long has he been making these jokes? Like, what's the time frame we're talking about here?
I mean, the headline of the Time story is Jay Leno apologizes for years of anti-Asian jokes. And so when I went to look at the statement, it says between 2002 and 2012, Leno made at least 9 documented jokes about Koreans or Chinese eating dogs or cats.
What? Come on. So I'm getting this feeling that you're not going to forgive him like he's asking. You feel like he should just go. He can't. Come on, let the guy go. He said he's sorry. It's fine. It's fine.
Oh my God. No. I mean, this is the sort of, when I hear
you
this
don't consider passive voice apologies to be good? Is that not?
This is the kind of I'm sorry that when I hear it, I just say, I'm sorry too. And like, best wishes to you and the rest of your career. This is an extremely opportunistic statement made because he was forced to, as far as I can tell, and because he has a show, probably also allegedly funny, coming out relatively soon. And he doesn't want forgiveness, he wants viewers, and I hope he gets none.
Okay. So in our last episode, we talked about consequences culture, and now Jay Leno is facing consequences from Sugi, if no one else. I'm happy to go along with you in your boycott because I've already boycotted that guy's career. I don't think he's funny either. We also talked about the need for accountability, partly in relation to the recent murders in Georgia. In that incident, 8 people were killed by a white gunman who targeted Asian massage parlors. 6 of the people he killed were working class Asian women. And while mainstream outlets were parroting the shooter, denying it was a hate crime, a Korean outlet reported that someone heard the shooter say he wanted to, quote, kill all Asians, unquote.
And so today we're going to continue that discussion because it's not just about these horrific recent incidents, but also some very long and very American history. This is absolutely who we are, but that's still something that we can change, and it's urgent that we do. I'm honored that we have 2 of my favorite writers here as guests to explore this topic. People whose writing about Asia and America and Asian Americans has been vital to my own understanding of that history and our future. Later in the show, we'll talk to my friend Peter Ho Davies, author most recently of the novels The Fortunes and A Lie Someone Told You About Yourself. But first, we're thrilled to be joined by Gish Jen.
Gish Jen is the author of 4 previous novels, a story collection, and 2 works of nonfiction. Her honors include the Lannan Literary Award for Fiction and the Mildred and Harold Strauss Living Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She delivered the William E. Massey Senior Lectures in American Studies at Harvard University. She's published in the Best American Short Stories of the Century, and her work appears in the New Yorker and other magazines. Her novel, The Resistors, came out in 2020, and she has a new collection of stories titled Thank You, Mr. Nixon, coming out with Knopf in February of 2022. Gish, welcome to the show.
Oh, my pleasure.
Gish, I'm so thrilled to have you here. You've been one of my role models as a writer since I was just starting out. And I remember meeting you now about like 20 years ago, which kind of blows my mind. And you've written about Americans and about Asian Americans in so many important ways. And I think of your work's tremendous humor, its inventiveness and structure and concept, the depth of character, and also the really expansive and porous ways you depict race, which is certainly true in The Resistors, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But first, after the recent violence in Atlanta, you wrote a New York Times op-ed about the generational differences in how Asian Americans have been viewing anti-Asian racism. So I wonder if you'd start us off by reading that piece.
Oh, sure. So this is in the New York Times. It's called The Generational Split in How Asian Americans See the Atlanta Shootings. Not my title. My mother, who immigrated to America in the 1940s, assumed my siblings and I would never really be accepted as American. Partly this was because there were so few Chinese immigrants when she came, but also it was a rough time for minorities. My parents' response to my brothers being beaten up, as he was just about every day in Yonkers, New York, was to sign him up for karate lessons. The world was a forest full of bears. There was no forest ranger. You had to defend yourself. Of all the figures who have emerged from the recent surge in anti-Asian violence, my parents would have most admired Xiao Zhanxie of San Francisco. This 75-year-old, having been punched for no reason, picked up a wooden plank and hit her 39-year-old assailant so hard he ended up on a stretcher. That woman was Han Vi. And yet, in his account of the incident, her grandson, John Chen, emphasized how terrified she was. Over and over, people speaking on behalf of Asian Americans in recent weeks have described how fearful people are, how afraid to leave their houses. Hearing which, all I could think was, there's been a sea change. Young people seem to believe that there are 4 strangers around who, if they don't exactly care, can be made to care, to sympathize, to come and help. I can hear my parents' voices and see their heads shaking. You know what they are, these young people? They're Americanized. You know what happens if you showed you're afraid? There's even more attacks. Cynics equate American individualism with an every man for himself social Darwinism my parents would recognize. Idealists sees it as an every person counts promise of respect and dignity. No one should be told to go back where she came from or be accosted with kung fu comments, and certainly no one should have to fear being assaulted, much less killed, because of her race. These two outlooks have long vied in the court of public opinion. With the killing of George Floyd, however, the idealists gained a decisive victory. His death made it clear, for those to whom it was not clear already, that the brutality and racism placed by Black Americans are an urgent concern for all Americans. Now, many Asian Americans wonder, will these horrific Atlanta murders prove to be a similar turning point? Will this country own the racism and misogyny behind the gunman's targeting of Asian women? Will Americans finally see these problems as everyone's problem? And most important, will they ask what needs to change? As Randy Park, the 23-year-old son of one of the victims, Hyun Jung Grant, said, his question to the shooter's family is, what did you all teach him? Right now, we Asian Americans are proving to be a great test case of the question, is America America? It's a question at which my parents would have scoffed. Of course not, they would have said. And let me pay heartfelt tribute here to their self-respect and their resilience, which we would do well to retain. But the time has come not just to cope, but to move the world forward. Can we? Americanized as I am, American that I am, I can only hope there are 4 strangers around.
Thank you so much. I thought that that was such an interesting and fresh take on the shift in how we talk about this, which I hadn't really thought about in those terms, from we must defend ourselves to it's the world's turn to move forward and to change. In the piece, you ask if this will be a turning point, and I look back at earlier turning points and I wonder what it would take to make this moment into that. What do you think?
Well, of course, it's hard to say. I mean, we all hope it will be a turning point. And yet, of course, we know from George Floyd, I mean, that was not exactly the first instance of anti-Black violence, right? I mean, it took one incident after another, for years for anything to happen. And, in likewise, we Asian Americans, have been working on this problem for a long, long time. I mean, it's not like it just cropped up now. I think that, it goes back to, if you think about the race riots, like 1871, I mean, in LA, 19 people were massacred then, in LA Chinatown. That was 10% of the Chinese population in LA at the time. The people were so malicious, they not only shot these 19 people, they shot them and then hanged them. It wasn't enough to shoot them. And of course, all the perpetrators got off. So, this is like an old problem in America. But I think that in terms of, what we can do, I think that, of course, at least one piece of the puzzle that is kind of ours to handle, and that's to do something about the representation, right? And, representation, what are the issues? What are we writing about? What are we bringing to the audience's attention? Again, this is not an effort that started today, So if we look at the problem with these Atlanta massage workers, The whole problem of their having, been hypersexualized. I mean, there's been a lot of ink spilled on this, the hypersexualizing of Asian women. The fact of the matter is that, we had Miss Saigon and we had Madame Butterfly, but we also had people writing against that for a long time. So David Henry Fong wrote M. Butterfly in 1988, in which he just deconstructed the very myth, the very stereotype that unfortunately is still with us. But it just goes to show that, we writers, we do have responsibility. And I will say that people have been taking responsibility for a long time. But obviously, just as we see with the Black Americans, it is going to take a long time. I mean, they've had novels like Passing, which is about, Nella Larson's novel. I mean, that was, the 1930s, Now that's being made into a Netflix, series, finally. But it is a century later. I mean, it's a little,
Speaking of representation and stuff like that, I was thinking about what my son gets taught in school, for instance, right? And learning about, so he gets a lot of information about the Black civil rights movement, but I don't think he gets taught about any of the things that you're talking about, right? I don't think that the Asian experience in America, and particularly just, confronting racism, is not memorialized or discussed in official quarters like schools in the same way that the civil rights experience was for Black Americans.
You're absolutely right. Now, to be fair, I will say that, unfortunately, the problem with the African Americans is, can be dated to the very first moments of American history. I am very concerned. I mean, when you see things like grannies being slammed on the street, and they're standing there and some guy feels like he can just go over and hit this woman, it's not okay, period, right? But it is true that from a historical point of view that, I don't think that the problems with the Asians are as foundational to America as the problems with the African Americans. It's just not, the numbers are much smaller, and that's another thing. The numbers are much smaller. That said, I do think that much more attention needs to be paid to it. I mean, I think that this is a country where we, in some ways, the great gift of America is that we have social mobility. But the downside of that is that we have social anxiety. We have tremendous, tremendous status anxiety. It's everyone is concerned about their status all the time. And of course, historically, what people have done when they feel insecure is they look for another group to be superior to, right? And that group, one of the big groups to which people, like certain people feel that they could always kind of put down and safely be above has been, African Americans. But another group has been the Asian Americans, and especially Asian American women. So if you think about who's an authority figure, who could you readily accept as a boss? And I can tell you that most people, meaning many white Americans, would be very disconcerted to say have a 5-foot Asian American woman sort of appear as their new boss. I can tell you a lot of that. Do you know what I mean? And she's going to face, a million times more problems than a white male in the same situation.
I do think about that.
And that has got to change. I mean, that has got to change. I mean, I think that, I think that in terms of how it's going to change, I mean, I think we need representations of Asian Americans and the victimhood and all that people have put up with. But we need the strong figures too. That's one of the reasons I wrote the research. We need the strong figures too, because I think that this whole question is interesting. Since I wrote my op-ed, many people have written to me, but especially people who have actually been figures of authority. They actually wielded authority. Their take is crying victim will get you nowhere, and I know why they say that. I know why they say that. It's interesting. I'm not, we have, Suki and I have a mutual friend, Eileen Pollock, who's a very good tennis player. I'm nowhere near the tennis player she is, and I never will be. But I did play on a tennis ladder very briefly, but long enough to understand that, like in some ways that this is how America works. You know what I mean? There's like a tennis ladder. People are very anxious to move up the ladder. And when they don't bother the people who are below them, do you know what I mean? But if they see somebody 3 rungs up who they think is vulnerable, they will challenge. I talked to somebody who's like on a board of a million things, an Asian American woman, and then she's like, basically she challenges, she faces 10 times more, more challenges than anybody else in the room. Challenge on every level. And what's that about? They think they can take her out, right? They think they can take her out, and they think that she's horrible, right? And it has something to gain by that. And what you can sort of see, that one of the things I worry about is with the victimhood narrative, without counteracting narratives of strength, is that people will get the idea. You know what I mean? On one hand, it will work with human resources because, HR will be in there. You say you're a victim, they'll go in there and protect you. But as soon as you rise to a certain level, you're going to find that the victimhood narrative is actually going to backfire. You know what I mean? That it's basically be a target on your back, and it's going to make the situation actually worse. So, it's complicated. But anyway, as writers, it's our job to kind of claim some territory, take up some space. And you're right, get these stories into the schools. But like I say, it's a mix of stories. It's not just like, microaggression. And it's true. I'm not saying that those things aren't going on, but it's also true that, without also projecting our strength, I think we will find ourselves with no progress forward.
Your comments remind me of Senator Tammy Duckworth, who's a politician that I followed for a long time, that it made, I was interested in her because I wrote about the war in my last novel, and I was a reporter in Iraq. So she's someone who projects strength, but has to go to such extremes. She loses both her legs. She's a war veteran, and still, right? That's what it would take. That's what it takes really for an Asian American politician to have authority, is like to wrap themselves in all of these American cliches in a way, but also genuine sacrifice for the country, right? And even then, she's often questioned, I think.
Yeah, of course she's questioned. You know what I mean? I was thinking about that when I was thinking about your podcast. But in terms of what we can do, you're absolutely right. So an Asian American woman in that position, it's just like Gwen in my novel. The challenge is 10 times larger than it is for a white man in that position, without any question. And yes, you have to show your heroism. You can never flinch. You can never flinch. You can never show any weakness, right? But in terms of like what we can do, I think that you're sort of like Suki went right in there. So I'm like, what are we going to do? One way we writers, we can't do anything. We're so useless, But except for in kind of a general kind of way. And I think that that's one thing that we can do is we can kind of change the climate of expectation. And that's what I think that we should be trying to do. I actually just yesterday, I interviewed Margaret Atwood, and she was talking about what it was like to be a woman at Harvard, in the 60s, and, how when she took her, she was a graduate student, when she took her oral exams, it's just like they didn't really test her because basically they didn't really expect that she would ever go on to be anything. She didn't have to pass a real oral exam because she was never going to be a threat. She wasn't going to be up for a job. Are you kidding? She's a woman, But I think that you can change that, that climate of expectation. I would say my experience at Radcliffe was exactly the opposite. So there she was, as a grad student, we were there under some somewhat different circumstances, but the first time I went to the Radcliffe Institute, which was 86, 87, so that's 2 decades later. First time we went around the circle to introduce ourselves, someone said, what are you? I was the youngest bumping fellow. And I said I was a would-be writer. And they said, all these women jumped on me. It's like, you can't never say that again. You're a writer. The first time I ever said I was a writer was because I was in this climate of expectation where you weren't supposed to be a would-be writer, you're supposed to be a writer. And what happened in that climate of expectation? That was on Monday. And by Friday, I had been a person who barely thought, I didn't know what I was doing at the Institute. I couldn't believe I'd gotten this fellowship. In fact, in applying, I had, it's funny, I'd gotten to the stage where they're looking for recommendations, and they said my second recommendation hadn't come in, and I hadn't done anything about it. Just so happens I ran into somebody else and said, what? They asked you for second recommendation. She didn't do anything. She actually walked up. This is Martha Collins, the poet. She walked up to Becker's office and said, I'm Gish Jen, second recommender. I wouldn't have done anything because obviously I was going to get a funding. You know what I mean? But I'm saying on Monday, I was in this climate of expectation. By Friday, I had written It's an American Story. And I thought, I'm going to write a novel. And the typical American was born on Friday. The word novel had never crossed my mind. But in this climate of expectation, suddenly there it was. And not only did I write a novel, I wrote a novel, and this is how long this struggle has been going on, that claimed full Americanness for Asian Americans. First line, it's an American story, which I cannot tell you how much flack I got for that. I mean, the amount of flack. What do you mean it's an American story? How could an Asian American call for novel typical American? I cannot tell you how much, you know. But on the other hand, I can always tell you some things that have moved forward. And I think we need to move it forward, and I think that we can. But like I say, these are the things that are within the control of us writers, is to write the narratives and to control the climate.
So when we're talking about this climate of expectations and changing how we think about ourselves and how we think about others, you know, I want to go back to in your Times essay, there's this forest ranger metaphor, which is really interesting. You chose a forest ranger, you didn't choose the police. And there's been all this criticism of Jay Barker from the Cherokee County Police Department, who said of that Atlanta shooter, you know, he had a bad day, which has been much quoted. I guess it was a really bad day for him, and this is what he did, end quote. And so there's been all this conversation, much of it driven by Black Lives Matter and aligned movements, about defunding the police. What do you think about the Asian American community's relationship with the police? How do we view the police, and how has that changed over time? Is that something in which writers have any agency to intervene?
I would say, you know, first of all, I cannot, you know, how complicated the Asian American community is. And I mean, it's just like, how can anybody even say that the reaction of the Asian American community is? The Asian American community ranges from far left to far right and everything in between. I don't think you can say the Asian American community has any reaction. I mean, you can't generalize. That's the first thing. And the second thing I will say is that, you know, I don't think that as a writer, you know, it's funny, I have struggled from day one with the question of whether I should be a representative voice. Do you know what I mean? And or I will say a representative victim. I mean, I think that came up really early too. So we're talking about in the late 1980s. You know, I mean, I made a very concerted decision that I would not be a professional victim, that I would be a writer. I wanted to be a writer, and that I would not be representative. You know what I mean? I'm not a spokesperson for me. I am a writer, you know. And so I will say that, you know, I guess to sort of say that, you know, I'll back on that. I don't think that I know what the reaction is. And I don't think, and as a writer, I don't think it's for me to answer. I think it's our job, and I think you'll probably agree with this, Vicky. I mean, it's our job to kind of represent people in a much more complicated way than the press would ever ask us to represent them. And the one thing about all this discussion, and it is incredibly important, and I'm glad it's going on, but it is very flattening, you know. So the good news is that you can talk about, you know, this microaggression and that microaggression, and this happens, you know, and look, the stories are endless. I mean, they are endless. And it's important to bring that to the public, but it's our job as a writer to kind of represent these people in a level of complexity that, you know, journalists have not thought to ask about. You know what I mean? So that their stories are, you know, as you know, people have undertaken a very, very, very complex cultural journey. Do you know what I mean? And it's our job to sort of to represent, like, what is it? Like, what is it they actually think about beyond the conversation about, you know, about race and gender, which is not to say that stuff ever goes away. It's always there. It's always there. But it's so far from the complete story. Do you know what I mean? So it's our job. And like I say, there are parts of the story that people, you know, your average journalist would just never even think to ask. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't cross their mind. And it's our job to tell them.
So what kind
there,
of things
whether
do
they
you
actually
think,
got it or not, because we're writers.
what kind of
But, yeah.
things do you think the press should be asking or
Mhm.
talking about that they're not talking about right now?
Well, I do think that one of the big issues behind the whole invisibility of the Asian American community, and and this is, like you could see this in the Atlanta shootings in the sense that how long it took to even figure out who these women were, much less what their stories were. I mean, the Korean community just, right? There's a lot of stuff in the Korean press, but the American press had a lot of trouble going in. And I think that their complete inability to understand what was going on, they do not understand collectivism.
They really don't.
They really don't. And they don't really realize they don't understand, right? They don't understand it. They don't, they sort of see it. They see these things happening. They don't have a name for them. And also, by the way, I think that, talk about white privilege or whatever, they basically think that the American self, not only they think it's universal, even though actually very, very, very tiny percentage of the world has this self. But Americans think it's universal. And they think also, by the way, that everybody is evolving to become them and would want to become them. And to be fully human is to be them, obviously. And I think, I would like to see the press take that up, because that is actually the driver of huge problems. I mean, let's just sort of say, if they had any idea what this self was, they never would have gotten involved in Vietnam. Never. They would never. They didn't understand. They did not understand what they were tangling with. They did not understand. And I think in this case, they can't understand these women. They can't understand what they're doing there. And also, like I say, I think this incredible condescension, which is really missing the incredible. I mean, look, to me, I'm a very big proponent of the hybrid self. I mean, I'm not, I don't think, we have a very individualistic side in America. There's so many good things about that, and we would never want to give those things up. But it is also true that, look at the handling of the pandemic, Taiwan, it was like no problem, right? Here we have 500,000 people died. I mean, it's just like, it's totally unnecessary. And in other societies, very, very, very much more able to deal with something like this. And that's not the only way in which they are. We have a lot to learn. So I guess, I would love to see the press pay a little more attention and go in with a little more humility and really try to understand kind of what's under the hood.
There's a really interesting Columbia Journalism Review article about the ways that ethnic Korean outlets covered the shootings and how they got so much better information much more quickly. There's been some interesting discussion about, I was watching people hunting for Korean speaking freelancers to cover this. I'm like, why are those people not on staff? I was so mad. Why have you not prioritized making your newsrooms people able to cover the actual country that we live in? And I think one of the other interesting things behind what you're saying, you're talking about collectivism and individualism. And I think one of the things that I admire so much about your work is the way that, right, you take a phrase like typical American, you're taking a stereotype and you're dismantling it. Which is, I think, one of the things that from a craft point of view, like I'm interested in the ways that's represented in fiction. I think also when you're talking about collectivism and individualism and the ways that Americans are unaware of the self, it also seems to me like Americans are not good readers of political manipulation, which has to do with that conception of individualism. So, right, for example, like the Atlanta shootings have to do with, right, like a very specific kind of anti-Asian racism that predates Trump. And then on the other hand, around the country, we have these other attacks, which are very obviously connected, despite, the protestations of various useless individuals who are interested in denialism, right? It's very obviously connected to Trump's xenophobic coronavirus rhetoric, his Trump administration officials saying Kung flu, imported virus from China, et cetera, et cetera. And Americans are so bad at reading that this is manipulation and that it's a way to foment violence. So I don't know, I'm interested in a kind of writing that makes people, I'm interested in putting pressure on the self, but I'm also curious about putting pressure on readers to be better, smarter readers, because so much of the time, I feel like what I want is someone to read me more intelligently, which sounds narcissistic, and maybe it is. And like, oh wow, an Asian American woman's going to be a narcissist. It's fine. It's happening right here, right now on the show. Like, I don't apologize, but I just think, I don't know, why is
You're not a narcissist.
I just think, like, why can't we read more intelligently? That's some of the problem, right? It's bad reading. And so, and it has made us unable to protect ourselves from things like Trump turning us into like vicious bullies and people who turn on each other. And so I'm curious about like what you think about why Americans are so bad at reading this kind of manipulation.
Well, I do think that, you know, if you look at the, you know, the sort of the cultural psychological studies, you know, about how the individualist versus the collectivist self focuses. So if you have a table in the room, it's like the individuals. I mean, this is a gross, you know, this is a gross simplification, right? The individualist will focus on the table, and the collectivist will focus on the room, you know? So, you know, collectivism is very associated with things like agrarian societies and everything. Of course, they're always looking at the sky, you know? They're not looking at themselves, you know, they're looking at the sky. And so there's kind of attention paid to, you know, to influences coming in, to the weather, to what's outside the self. And there's an awareness that, you know what I mean? Like what's outside the self is going to affect you, right? And so it's just where their focus is. Whereas, you know, Americans seem to think that, you know, the you know, the outside is kind of static in some way, and all the truth that you have to pay attention to is within. And that is, you know, that I think that's what you're saying. It's like basically they're not paying attention to the context, and they kind of they underestimate the context. Do you know what I mean? So, and they think that all their ideas are their ideas. You know, they've really adopted these ideas. They don't think of them as having come to them from some place. It's because they are, like I say, it's just like, you know, and you know, you can run studies. I mean, you know, there's a lion in the savannah, you know, and the individualistic self will focus on that lion and try to understand the lion's motivation, you know. And you know, sometimes I used to give talks on this, and you know, I can show this lion and the savannah, and then they're so focused on the lion that you can put a UFO, and I mean a big UFO, in the sky, and they don't see it. So half the audience starts laughing, and that's how you know, right there. It's kind of basically everybody with a collectivist side immediately starts laughing, and people who are very individualistic miss the UFO.
Well, the description of that kind of blindness
truly don't see it.
Is
yes.
Reminds me of the resistors, and maybe this is a good time to sort of shift to talking about that book, because there's a line in that you have these two classes of people, the netted, who are the sort of upper class, and the surplus. And there's a line in the book that says the very definition of the netted is people who see nothing. I mean, that privilege is an ability to ignore, right? Isn't that kind of what you're talking about here?
You are absolutely correct. Yes. And I do think, you know, and privilege is a kind of blindness, right? I mean, not only the blind to their own privilege, you know, blinding altogether. And, you know, in a general kind of way too, I will say that, you know, the richer people become, and this is very well studied, the more oblivious, you know, the more convinced they are that they got to where they are from, you know, from something inside them. I mean, the more individualistic, you know? So kind of, if there's some kind of scale with like, well, what contributed to this situation, you or the situation, the more individual, the richer you are, the more individualistic you become, and the more convinced you are that it was you. You know, and the more convinced you are, by the way, that the trouble with everybody else is them too. You know what I mean? It's just like, you know, it wasn't that they happened to be living, you know, on top of a gold mine. It's just that no. It was, you know, I was the superior being, and I was superior self.
I mean, the problem with Jay Barker, the guy in Atlanta who it was later found out had posted on Facebook, you know, endorsing shirts that called COVID imported virus from China, spelled, not only that is just outright racist, but it means that he doesn't consider these women who were killed in Atlanta as part of his constituency. They aren't seen as a person he's supposed to protect.
Absolutely.
Have that shirt.
Absolutely. And I guess that, you know, what you're saying is absolutely right. I mean, one of the problems with this kind of cultural superiority as the people with another self are not completely human. In other words, like humanity is synonymous with having the same self that you have, and and yeah, so that's pretty problematic. I mean, especially in a police chief, and other figures of authority. I will say too, I mean, I don't want to generalize, but if I were to generalize, it's not just Asians who tend to have a more collectivistic side. And I do think it's just a side. I mean, I think that most people are pretty hybrid, but it is women. You know what I mean? Women tend to have a more collectivistic side.
And it's so interesting to hear you say all of these things about politics and the collective and the individual, and to think about the resistors, which uses baseball very much as the vehicle for this political story. And I wonder if you could read to us from the resistors.
Okay, just a very, very, very short section, about baseball and America. As you guys know, this book is about it's about a dystopian world in which it's an apartheid-like world. That in the future, it's every nightmare has come to pass. We have environmental disaster. We have technological problems, to put it mildly. In the middle of all of this, there is this girl, Gwen, who's formed the Golden Arm, so she's quite a picture. Anyway, in the section that I'm going to read, she is actually, lo and behold, ended up kind of in the Olympics. And she's talking about how afraid her teammates are of the China-Russia teams. China and Russia have gotten together, and they're afraid to leave because they've been genetically engineered, and so now they're all switch hitters to their chagrin. But anyway, she's talking about her teammates, and she says, perhaps all this was fear, pure and simple, on the part of Gwen's teammates. But feeding their obsession, of course, was the sense that baseball was more than a sport, that it was a crown jewel. There were people who said it wasn't even invented in America. There were people who pointed out it was mentioned by Jane Austen long before it was ever mentioned here. But if baseball took on a hallowed meaning, it took on that meaning in our American dream. For was this not the level playing field we envisioned? A field on which people could show what they were made of? And didn't we Americans believe above all that everyone should have a real chance at that? Didn't we believe that with the good of the team at heart, something in us might just hit a ball off our shoe tops and send it sailing clear out of the park? If Gwen's teammates were playing China-Russia for something, I thought, it was for this. For a chance to show, my mother would have said, that even if we all return to the dirt and the wind and the rain like the plants and the animals, we had a bigness in us, something beyond algorithms and beyond upgrades, something we were proud to call human, or so it seemed to me. And so you can sort of see, yes, America, democracy, those are very much the concerns of my book. The level playing field. What will happen to that in the field in the future? I mean, baseball has been observed to be the great American sport from the beginning. What Whitman said, it had the snap, go, swing of the American atmosphere. I will say though too that American also has the, I was just sort of saying that this thing about competition. If you look at the relationship of the batter and the pitcher, it's one against the other. I can tell you that in this most American of sports that, it's very much about democracy and so on, but at the very heart of it, there is this duel and no one shows fear. No one shows fear. No one says, I'm a victim. No, they just go, the object is to intimidate the shit out of the opponent and just psych them out any way you can. And you got to throw the inside, you know what I mean? So if they think they're going to get killed, you do it. And that's American too. You know what I mean? So it's both the idealism and the realism, I think.
So when and how did you become a baseball fan?
The funny thing is I'm not really that much of a fan, but I will say my family are rabid fans. And that's a very immigrant story. I mean, their parents, as you know, are Chinese immigrants. And like many immigrants, they came to America. One of the first ways that they kind of performed being American was to go to a ball game, learn who to root for. Of course, it's an incredible introduction to America because, I mean, all these ideas, the level playing field, everybody gets a turn at that. The idea that there's a game that's set up to bring out the best in us. You know what I mean? That's very carefully with rules that everybody agrees on. Let's start there. Like the rules, everybody has to agree on the rules. I mean that if you're coming from China, that's like a very strange idea. Anyway, you learn all about America this way, and then many of them go on to be big baseball fans. The first thing they learn about America, they become very attached to it. That was true of my mother. My mother was the most rabid Yankees fan you could possibly imagine.
I hate the Yankees.
I know. There was. I know. We had a lot of trouble there. But I tell you, at one point, she did pass away recently. But before that, it was a terrible, it was a terrible moment where she was very, very sick, and she was unconscious, and we're all racing down to her bedside. We all thought that she was going to die, and so she's lying there. She's not responsive. And my brother, who's alone with my mother, trying to get her to respond, he leans over her and he says to her, he says, "Mom," he said, "the Red Sox are eating our lunch." Just the Yankees are in a slump. And just like that, my mother, who'd been totally non-responsive for days, that her eyes open up, and without missing a beat, she says, "That Aaron Boone should be fired." The manager of the Yankees.
Well,
I mean, I shouldn't laugh. My mother actually died of COVID, last year, and
I remember seeing that, and I want to just tell you,
yeah.
I mean, we're speaking in person for the first time, but we're friends on Facebook, and so I was very sorry. I remember you posting about it. It was sad.
Too.
I'm
sorry
thank you. Yeah.
loss.
Yeah, and we, I don't know if I posted this on Facebook. I don't think I did. But
I thought I knew about this when you said it. Somehow I knew.
She died. Yeah, I did post that she died, but thank you, and but anyway, we did bury her with a Yankees cap.
Well, baseball's an incredibly international sport too.
That was my mother.
I mean, baseball's not, it's weird. China is big on the NBA, and basketball sort of seems to be the national sport in China, at least from what I understand. But baseball is big in South America. It's big in Japan. It's big in South Korea, not so big in Europe, but it has this international flair that's interesting.
Yeah, although it is, because one of the reasons it's so big in Japan is because, of the American occupation.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, it's a sandbox sport. You can play it anywhere. You need something to throw. You need a stick. All those kids in the Dominican Republic. It's just like, I mean, and when you hear what these kids will hit with, or what they'll hit, I mean, a lot of times they don't have a ball, and they'll hit a rock, and I mean, it's amazing. But there is something about it which is very, very accessible. And I mean, it's wonderful. But
thank you so much for joining us today, and we really appreciated you coming in to talk.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thanks, Gish. And listeners, don't forget to pick up Gish Jen's brilliant novel, The Resistors. And thank you, Mr. Nixon, coming in 2022.